The Eldrazi literally have a huge impact on the plane of Zendikar. But who are the Eldrazi? Let's go inside R&D and see what we can do to make the unknowable knowable.
Eldrazi. Oh man.
The Eldrazi are unfathomable, unknowable. That is kind of their whole shtick. They are otherworldly. They're not even from physical space.
You could say things like unknowable. You could say inscrutable. You could say, beyond our comprehension. But ultimately, you can't just have blank cards.
Something that I watched for when I was working on the names and flavor text, the flavor text in particular, is never letting any of the flavor text talk or even really speculate about what might be going on in an Eldrazi's head. It knows, it sees, it remembers. No, none of that. It doesn't do those things. That's not how Eldrazi are.
Now, there's no greater advocate of the color pie than me, and one of the things the color pie does is it's a safety net. It says, hey, there's lots of good cards, but you can't play all the good cards. And when we did too much colorlessness, it's like, yes, you can. You can play all the colorless cards. And that was a problem. So I needed to solve the problem of, I wanted all the Eldrazi to be colorless, but I didn't want to break the color pie. How do I do that?
When I first heard that the design team was pitching these ghost fire cards, meaning cards that were colorless but had colored mana costs, I thought, what a nightmare.
My first day that I came to Wizards working as a graphic designer for Magic R&D, I was given the task to work on the devoid frames. Back then, we didn't know it was going to be a frame treatment. We thought it was going to be a color indicator bullet.
It's very hard in a visual way to say I'm not anything. Like, here's a circle, I'm not something. Well, what do you make the circle? Well, you can't not make it something. How do you convey that that's not, So there was no way to convey with a symbol like circle that I'm not something.
So at that point, I started working with design and development to look at when we wanted to see that card as red and when we wanted to see it as colorless. And we decided we wanted to read it as red when you're drafting, because that's when you're going to be looking more closely at what you can sort of afford to put in your deck. And we wanted it to look colorless on the battlefield when you're playing it, because that's when colorless matters in the mechanics.
We weren't sure we could be able to do the mechanic at all unless we knew we could nail it visually.
It was never planned as a mechanic. The entire run of design, it wasn't a mechanic. It ended up becoming a mechanic because the only way to clearly define it was by calling it something. And so it ended up being called devoid.
When we're talking about adding this word that just completely defies your expectations, putting devoid on these cards and saying everything you knew about the cards before about how to tell what was true about them might not be true anymore. We were nervous. Yeah, I was very nervous.
So another reason I really like the colorless theme is we're not doing tribal anymore. Every Eldrazi doesn't say Eldrazi on it. And I wanted to have some way to do things that affected the Eldrazi, and I had no mechanical way of doing that by reference calling them Eldrazi. I mean, I could affect the creatures, because they're Eldrazi creature type, but I couldn't affect all the cards. So by doing colorless things, I could make things that cared about everything. And the wonderful thing about this is, the previous set was Khans of Tarkir. It had a morph theme. Morph our colorless creatures. And so we did this neat thing where, within the confines of this set, in Limited, it's all about the Eldrazi, but in Standard, the colorless matters actually plays in and combines with the set before it.
So Battle for Zendikar is mixing some of what we saw in Zendikar, the original Zendikar, where it was very aggressive, with what we saw in Rise of the Eldrazi, where it was all about ramping out mana to cast these expensive creatures. That means this set is combining both of these things. So Eldrazi Spawn needed to play more than one role. 0/1 tokens are by nature just defensive and just good for ramping you out. The 1/1 Eldrazi Scions both can attack and can provide mana to cast your big Eldrazi creatures.
So I go to Mark and I tell him they're playing a lot more fun as 1/1s. What do you think of spawns being 1/1s instead of 0/1s? And he tells me, if I knew that was allowed, I would have done it myself.
Creatively, we had an opportunity to really express this idea that left alone, the Eldrazi are going to get bigger, they're going to get meaner, they're going to get more powerful. They were slumbering for 6,000 years, but now they're kind of getting their bearings. So we really wanted to make sure it was loud that the Scions, these 1/1s, were not just these 0/1 spawns.
So we knew when we upgraded to 1/1 from 0/1 that another thing we were going to have to do is look at what we were giving you at these high mana costs and make sure we were giving you something that you were willing to sacrifice real creatures for.
The thing we wanted to do with Ulamog was absolutely clearly put across the idea that this character is really, really hungry and is just going to eat everything in sight. And so we have this gigantic creature that takes a 20-card bite out of your opponent's library every time he attacks.
We also wanted Ulamog to feel connected to the rest of the Eldrazi in this set. So every time we tried a new thing for the Eldrazi to be about, we sort of like reimagined Ulamog as being the best at that thing, or the lord of that thing.
One of the important considerations we had when we designed Oblivion Sower is that we knew we were going to have a big Eldrazi that was the face of the duel deck that's coming out with Battle for Zendikar, and we knew that whatever Eldrazi we put on the face of that duel deck, it wanted to be really representative of the conflict between the Eldrazi and the Zendikari. And so when you think about what's Zendikar all about, well, it's the plane of exploration, it's the plane of lands, it has landfall, it has all these cool non-basic lands. And so what's the cruelest thing that an Eldrazi can do to Zendikar is to just like desecrate and steal and manipulate its lands. So we wanted to create an Eldrazi that in a very alien and Eldrazi way, it messed with your lands.
Desolation Twin was a favorite of the design team. They really were enamored with this idea of, let's actually give you 20 power worth of Eldrazi that unchecked could kill your opponent, in a couple swings once you get through those defenses.
So Endless One is kind of like a Hydra, right? We have these Hydras in Magic that cost X and 1 or 2 colored mana, and you get a 0/0 with X +1/+1 counters on it. We realized that we had a unique opportunity here to make a Hydra that didn't have any colored mana symbols in its mana cost because the Eldrazi are colorless. We thought, can we do it? Can we really do this? Can we make an X that gives you X +1/+1 counters? Well, it turned out we could.
We wanted Eldrazi to be alien and weird and off-putting, and a synonym for that is odd. And sort of jokingly in a meeting one day, we came up with what if the Eldrazi are really odd? And someone was like, well, what do you mean? Do you mean odd like strange, or odd like, the parity of a number as in contrast to even?
It was a thing that felt very weird and arbitrary and served to illustrate that the Eldrazi just have totally different priorities than humans do. They're just thinking about completely different things than humans are, and who can understand them? They care about odd numbers. That's totally weird.
Usually when we develop sets, we only have so many large creatures, and whether a creature is 7/8 or 8/9 has a smaller impact on the game. They're just enormous. But now you have a 7/8 that gained you 5 life, and I have an 8/9 trample. Now they're really different because I'm going to attack, and if you block, yours dies and mine doesn't. And suddenly the enormous sizes, even though they're only a little different, it's as different as a 3/3 and a 2/2.
When you look at a card that has Devoid, we want you to have a sense that something is off about this card other than the frame and the Devoid. So for example, a card like Kozilek's Sentinel is, cost 1 and a red. You're used to seeing red creatures that cost 1 and a red. You're not so used to seeing cards that cost 1 and a red and are 1/4s.
So the Eldrazi are these massive interplanar beings, and what they do is consume. So they need lots of fuel. And Ingest is an ability that's going to give them that fuel. So Ingest is on creatures. Whenever a creature deals combat damage to a player, that player is going to exile the top card of his or her library. Face up, everyone gets to see it. And those cards hanging out in exile, as we'll see in a bit, very useful for the Eldrazi side.
The Eldrazi have the ingest mechanic in this set, and this represents their voracious hunger. They're eating the entire plane and everyone in it. In the old Rise of the Eldrazi set, we had the Annihilator mechanic. We found that could only go on really big creatures, and so we wanted something that was a little less board impactful that we could put on smaller Eldrazi, because we wanted to have Eldrazi of every size in this set. And then, so the ingest creatures, exile cards, and then we have these Eldrazi processors, which are a special type of Eldrazi that essentially digest the cards that have been ingested. They process them and turn them into energy that the Eldrazi can use.
So what a processor does is it takes cards an opponent owns from exile,
puts it into that player's graveyard to get some effect. Now, sometimes it's an activated ability, sometimes it's a triggered ability when the Eldrazi enters the battlefield. Each one's different, so read the cards carefully. But if you see Processor, you know you're going to want to get cards from your opponents into exile so you can eat them for some awesome effects.
The reason that we ended up being okay with Process in the way it works, taking these cards out of exile, is that in order for your opponent to get their exiled card back into their graveyard, you have to give it to them.
It was a really challenging mechanic to get right, but also really rewarding when we finally started to see the outcome of all of our effort happening in limited play and seeing those cool ingest decks come together. And it's just kind of a really unique experience that you can't get anywhere else in Magic.